Welcome everyone to the sixth in the video series entitled What Can We Learn From? Glad to see that May has finally arrived and spring has sort of arrived. I know it's been a little cooler this week and kind of nice last week, so hopefully the warm weather will return and we can have a nice spring here. So for this lesson, as the sixth one here, as we've been looking at different people throughout the Bible and different lessons that we can learn from them. Today we're going to look at Abraham. And there are many things that Abraham, does within Scripture. Abraham is one of the most prominent people in the Bible. And there are many lessons that we can take from his life and the different things that he did. Nobody's mentioned more in the Old Testament than Abraham aside from Moses. So he's a very prominent figure that we can learn a lot from. In James chapter 2, it talks about Abraham and calls him God's friend. And then in Galatians chapter 3, it says that all believers are called children of Abraham. So everything kind of came from Abraham and the promises that God gave to him. And everything that followed from his life and his genealogy on. What we want to look at today, specifically about Abraham, is that Abraham showed sacrifice. One of the most famous stories of Abraham is when he went to sacrifice his son Isaac. And so we're going to look at that account today and see how Abraham was willing to go through with that and willing to sacrifice everything he had towards God. So the account of Abraham and Isaac happens in Genesis chapter 22. Starting in verse 2, it says, "Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.'" Skipping over to verse 9. "When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy,' he said. 'Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son.' Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, 'I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me.'" Now, this is a really incredible story, a story that many of us have heard many times, many times. But it's always an incredible story every time you hear it. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son because he knew that God wanted him to. He understood the command from God. He understood that this is something that God was asking of him. And even though it would be very difficult to do, Abraham knew that this is what God was asking for, and so he was willing to trust and obey God and follow God in this. So when we look at this story and this account of Abraham willing to sacrifice his only son because God asked him to, we can't imagine doing that, to sacrifice one of our kids. But we need to know that, hopefully we won't be asked to do that, but we are asked to sacrifice certain things in our life. And so as we think about this story of Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice that Abraham was willing to make, we can ask ourselves, what can we sacrifice in our lives to God? What are we willing to give up to God? What are some things that may be distracting us from God that we need to be sacrificing? And specifically at this time, as we've maybe given up certain luxuries, certain things that we're used to doing that we may not be able to do. We think of what have we given up during this time? Has it been hard on you? Has it been fairly easy on you? I'm sure there are certain things that you miss. I know for sure that we're missing worship together on Sundays, and that's something that we're used to doing, that we like to do, and that's not real easy to give up for quite a while here. It's been a while now since we've been able to meet on Sundays, and so we miss that. But there's other things in our lives too, of things that we may have had to sacrifice that may not seem so hard to give up. Now that we've given it up, maybe you're realizing that it really wasn't that big of a deal to have in my life. It wasn't really that hard to do. But there may be some things like worshiping together that's very hard to give up. And so we need to recognize in our lives things that may be hard for us to give up, but some things God may want us to give up if it's distracting us from Him. We need to know that everything belongs to God, and we need to be willing to sacrifice for God. Abraham was willing to sacrifice everything he had. He was willing to sacrifice his only son because God asked him to. And that amount of trust and faith and obedience is very commendable. And so as we look at that story and we try to understand what Abraham was going through, it can help us to know that there are things in our lives that we need to sacrifice as well to God. So I hope during this time, as our lives are a little bit different, that we are willing to examine our lives and see maybe certain things that we maybe need to give up, that we need to sacrifice to God. As we read through the Old Testament, and for Abraham, sacrifice was something very familiar to them. They sacrificed to God on a regular basis. And for us, sacrifice in that way isn't as common. We don't do the sacrifices that they did in the Old Testament. Our sacrifices, though, still exist. There are still certain things that we need to sacrifice. And so I encourage all of us at this time to think about things that maybe are distracting us from God or keeping us from doing certain things that we may need to sacrifice. I hope this lesson has been good as we reflect on Abraham and Isaac. I encourage you to read through the entire account here and read through Abraham's life. And I hope that we're all staying safe and healthy. So thank you for listening, and God bless.